Joseph Kasavubu. Joseph Kasavubu was the first president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, then the Republic of Congo, from 1960 to 1965, but his tenure is largely remembered for his collaboration with Belgium and the United States in the removal of nationalist leader Patrice Lumumba. Unlike Lumumba, who sought true independence from Western control, Kasavubu was closely aligned with Western interests, particularly Belgium and the US, both of which wanted to retain control over Congo's vast mineral wealth, including uranium, which had been used for the US atomic bomb project. As a more moderate leader who did not challenge Western dominance, Kasavubu found support among Belgian and US officials who saw Lumumba as a threat due to his perceived pro-Soviet stance. In 1960, Congo descended into chaos with the Katanga secession crisis, led by Moise Tshombe, who declared independence for the mineral-rich province with Belgian military and business backing. When Lumumba called for Soviet assistance to counter Western-backed separatists, Kasavubu, under pressure from Western diplomats, dismissed him as prime minister in September 1960, triggering a political crisis. Shortly after, Lumumba was arrested, tortured, and executed in early 1961 by Belgian-backed forces in Katanga with CIA complicity. With Lumumba gone, Kasavubu was left as a weak leader, increasingly overshadowed by General Mobutu Sese Seko, who had been secretly working with the CIA to consolidate power. In 1965, Mobutu overthrew Kasavubu in a US-backed coup, marking the end of Kasavubu's Western-backed presidency and the beginning of a brutal dictatorship under Mobutu that lasted 3 decades. Kasavubu's legacy is often seen as that of a leader who prioritized Western political interests over Congolese sovereignty, playing a role in one of Africa's most tragic betrayals, the assassination of Lumumba, Congo's best chance at true independence. Felix Houphouet-Boigny. Felix Houphouet-Boigny was the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, ruling from 1960 until his death in 1993, making him one of Africa's longest-serving leaders and one of France's most loyal allies. Unlike many of his contemporaries who pursued complete independence from colonial rule, Houphouet-Boigny firmly believed that Africa's future was best served by maintaining close ties with France, a stance that led him to become the primary architect of France-Afrique, the system of continued French political and economic dominance in its former colony. Before Côte d'Ivoire's independence, he had been a prominent politician in France, serving as a minister in the French government, which gave him deep connections with the French political elite. Upon becoming president, he ensured that Côte d'Ivoire remained almost entirely dependent on France for economic, military, and political affairs. His government allowed French companies to dominate the Ivorian economy, particularly in cocoa, coffee, timber, and mining, making Côte d'Ivoire a highly profitable neo-colonial state for France while limiting real economic power for Ivorians. In return, France provided him with financial aid, military protection, and political support, ensuring his grip on power for over 3 decades. While his policies resulted in strong economic growth in the 1960s and 1970s, they also created deep inequalities, as the wealth generated by French-controlled industries never truly benefited the majority of Ivorians. He also actively worked against African nationalist movements, opposing leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, both of whom rejected French control. His loyalty to France was so extreme that when Sékou Touré removed French influence from Guinea, Houphouet-Boigny supported French economic sabotage against the country. Even in the 1980s, when France-Afrique became a widely criticized system, Houphouet-Boigny remained one of its strongest defenders, ensuring that France retained a military presence in Côte d'Ivoire and that the country continued to use the French-controlled CFA franc currency. His long reign was only brought to an end by his death in 1993, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most pro-French African leaders in history, a man who sacrificed his country's full independence to serve France's political and economic interests. Gnassingbe Eyadema. Gnassingbe Eyadema ruled Togo from 1967 until his death in 2005, making him one of Africa's longest-serving dictators and one of France's most loyal enforcers in West Africa. Before seizing power, Eyadema was a French-trained soldier who played a direct role in the 1963 assassination of Togo's first president, Sylvanus Olympio, a nationalist leader who had sought to break free from French control by creating a new independent currency instead of using the CFA franc, which was controlled by France. Olympio's murder, backed by pro-French military officers, allowed Togo to remain under Paris's economic and political influence. Eyadema later staged a coup in 1967 and established a brutal military dictatorship, banning opposition, crushing dissent, and securing unwavering French support in return for allowing France to maintain complete control over Togo's economy. Under his rule, French companies dominated Togo's phosphate industry, the country's primary export, with profits overwhelmingly benefiting France while the Togolese population remained in poverty. France ensured that Eyadema remained in maintained power through military support, financial aid, and by blocking international pressure for democratic reforms. In exchange for France's backing, Eyadema became one of Françafrique's most trusted enforcers, helping France suppress anti-colonial movements across Africa. His personal wealth grew enormously through corrupt deals with French corporations, while he maintained power through fear, assassinations, and rigged elections. Despite growing calls for democratization in the 1990s, Eyadema continued to receive direct French military assistance whenever his rule was threatened, most notably in 1993, when French forces helped him crush opposition protests. His legacy as France's strongman in Togo was further cemented when, upon his death in 2005, his son, Faure Gnassingbe, was installed as president with French support, continuing the family's neo-colonial rule. Eyadema's reign is remembered as one of the longest and most repressive pro-French dictatorships in Africa, ensuring that Togo remained a puppet state while his people suffered under decades of autocratic rule. Moise Tshombe was a pro-Western politician in the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire, who led the 1960 secession of Katanga, the country's richest and most resource-laden province. His leadership was defined by his close collaboration with Belgium, Western business interests, and mercenary forces to maintain foreign control over Katanga's vast mineral wealth, particularly copper, cobalt, and uranium. When Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, Patrice Lumumba, the country's first prime minister, sought to unify the nation and reclaim control over its resources from colonial interests. This threatened Belgium's economic grip on Congo, as Katanga was home to the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, UMHK, a powerful Belgian mining corporation. With Belgium's backing, Tshombe declared Katanga's independence in July 1960, effectively turning the province into a Western-backed puppet state. To maintain power, Tshombe hired European mercenaries and relied on Belgian military support, while the CIA and Western countries assisted in destabilizing Lumumba's government. His secession directly contributed to the capture and assassination of Lumumba in 1961, who had been overthrown in a coup and handed over to Tshombe's forces in Katanga, where he was brutally executed with Belgian and CIA complicity. Tshombe's rule over Katanga was marked by rampant corruption and the exploitation of Congolese resources by Belgian and Western companies, with little benefit to the local population. However, in 1963, the United Nations launched a military operation that forced Tshombe to flee into exile, ending Katanga's secession. Ironically, despite having worked to destroy Congolese unity, he was brought back in 1964 by Western powers as Prime Minister of Congo to counter communist and nationalist forces, essentially serving as a pro-Western puppet within a weak national government. His tenure was short-lived, as Mobutu Sese Seko, backed by the CIA, overthrew the government in 1965 and exiled Tshombe once again. In 1967, Tshombe was kidnapped in Algeria under mysterious circumstances, likely orchestrated by Mobutu and his Western allies, and died in exile in 1969. His legacy remains that of a Congolese leader who actively worked against his country's independence, siding with Western economic interests and playing a key role in one of Africa's most tragic betrayals, the killing of Patrice Lumumba. Uhuru Kenyatta served as Kenya's president from 2013 to 2022, during which time Kenya became increasingly indebted to foreign power, particularly China, while also maintaining strong economic ties with Western nations. As the son of Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first president, Uhuru inherited a legacy of political power and influence, but his presidency was marked by controversial economic policies that prioritized foreign investment over national self-sufficiency. One of his most criticized actions was his deep reliance on Chinese loans to fund large-scale infrastructure projects, particularly the standard gauge railway, SGR, roads, and energy projects. The SGR, which was financed with high-interest loans from China, ended up being one of the most expensive railway projects in Africa, with China maintaining significant control over its operations. Critics argue that these projects, while improving infrastructure, placed Kenya in a dangerous debt trap, with concerns that strategic national assets could be seized by China if Kenya defaulted on its loans. Beyond China, Kenyatta also strengthened Kenya's economic ties with Western corporations, particularly in the oil, agriculture, and telecommunications sectors, often at the expense of local businesses. His government signed trade agreements with the US, UK, and European Union, which critics claim favored Western companies over Kenyan industries, leading to increased foreign control over key economic sectors such as aviation, banking, and manufacturing. Additionally, land grabbing and corruption scandals linked to multinational companies and political elites further eroded public trust in his administration. By the time Kenyatta left office in 2022, Kenya's public debt had skyrocketed to record levels, raising concerns about economic sovereignty and whether Kenya had become too dependent on on foreign loans and investors. While he positioned himself as a leader focused on modernization and economic growth, many argue that his policies disproportionately benefited foreign powers and Kenya's political elite while burdening future generations with unsustainable debt. His legacy remains highly debated, with some crediting him for improving infrastructure, but others viewing him as a leader who prioritized foreign interests at the cost of Kenya's long-term economic independence. Blaise Compaore. Blaise Compaore ruled Burkina Faso from 1987 to 2014 after orchestrating the assassination of his former ally, Thomas Sankara, one of Africa's most revolutionary and anti-imperialist leaders. Sankara had been a fierce critic of neo-colonialism, rejecting French economic control, refusing IMF loans, and implementing socialist policies that prioritized national self-reliance. However, his radical stance against Western influence made him an enemy of France and other foreign powers, leading to his tragic assassination in a French-backed coup led by Compaore on October 15, 1987. After seizing power, Compaore immediately reversed Sankara's nationalist policies, reopening the country to Western corporations and financial institutions, particularly French businesses that had been sidelined under Sankara's government. He privatized state-owned enterprises, welcomed IMF and World Bank loans, and deepened military and economic ties with France. Under his rule, Burkina Faso became a key ally of France and the US in West Africa, particularly in security matters, allowing French and American military operations in the region. His regime was marked by widespread corruption, human rights abuses, and economic policies that favored foreign investors and the Burkinabe elite, while much of the population remained in poverty. Despite facing growing domestic opposition, Compaore stayed in power for 27 years with French support, rigging elections and suppressing dissent. However, in 2014, after attempting to extend his rule indefinitely, mass protests erupted, forcing him to flee to Côte d'Ivoire, where France provided him with political asylum. His downfall marked a rejection of neo-colonial rule in Burkina Faso, as many viewed his presidency as a betrayal of the revolutionary ideals of Sankara. In 2022, he was convicted in absentia for his role in Sankara's assassination, but he remains in exile, protected by the very foreign powers that benefited from his rule. Compaore's legacy is one of treachery, neo-colonial subservience, and the betrayal of a nation's fight for true independence. Jean-Bedel Bokassa. Jean-Bedel Bokassa ruled the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1979, first as a dictator and later as a self-proclaimed emperor, in one of the most absurd and grotesque displays of neo-colonial rule in African history. A French-trained soldier, Bokassa had served in the French military before leading a coup in 1966 against President David Dacko, with tacit French approval, to take control of the resource-rich but fragile country. In return for maintaining France's economic dominance over CAR's vast uranium, diamond, and timber industries, Bokassa received consistent financial and military support from Paris, particularly from French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Bokassa's rule was marked by extreme brutality, corruption, and extravagance. In 1977, he declared himself Emperor Bokassa I in a lavish coronation modeled after Napoleon Bonaparte's, costing an estimated $20 million, funded almost entirely by French taxpayers. While his people lived in extreme poverty, Bokassa spent millions on gold-plated thrones, silk robes, and diamonds, further deepening CAR's dependency on French aid. Despite his ruthless dictatorship, including the mass killing of political opponents, public executions, and even allegations of cannibalism, France continued to support him as long as its economic interests were protected. However, in 1979, when Bokassa ordered the massacre of schoolchildren protesting against his regime, international outrage forced France to turn against him. In Operation Barracuda, the French military launched a coup, removing Bokassa and reinstating his predecessor, David Dacko, another pro-French leader. Bokassa fled into exile in France, where he lived comfortably for years, further proving that he had always been a Western-backed dictator. His legacy is one of cruelty, absurd extravagance, and total subservience to French interests, though he was later allowed to return to CAR in 1986, where he was briefly imprisoned. His rule remains one of the most shocking examples of neo-colonial puppetry in Africa. His reign showed how France continued to exploit African nations through brutal leaders who prioritized foreign interests over their own people. Paul Biya has ruled Cameroon since 1982, making him one of the longest-serving leaders in African history and a prime example of France's neo-colonial grip over its former colonies. Taking over from Amadou Ahidjo, Biya quickly aligned himself with France, ensuring that French companies retained control over Cameroon's oil, timber, and banking sectors, while the country remained tied to the French-controlled CFA franc. His regime has been a textbook example of Françafrique, the system through which France France maintains indirect control over its former African colonies by backing authoritarian leaders who serve French economic and military interests. Despite Cameroon's vast natural wealth, Biya's economic policies have primarily benefited foreign corporations and a small elite, leaving much of the population impoverished. Biya's rule has also been marked by brutal repression of opposition, rigged elections, and violent crackdowns on protests. His government has imprisoned journalists, banned political rivals, and used the military to silence dissent. One of the most severe crises under his rule has been the Anglophone conflict, where English-speaking regions of Cameroon have faced brutal military suppression for demanding autonomy from the French-dominated government. Instead of addressing their grievances, Biya has allowed French-backed military forces to crush separatist movements, leading to mass killings, human rights abuses, and thousands of refugees fleeing to neighboring countries. Despite rising anti-French sentiment in Africa, Biya has remained one of France's most loyal allies, ensuring that French military presence in Cameroon continues and that Western economic interests are protected. Meanwhile, he has spent a large portion of his presidency governing from abroad, often in luxury hotels in Switzerland and France, while Cameroon faces economic stagnation, corruption, and growing civil unrest. His ability to remain in power for over 4 decades is largely due to French diplomatic and financial support, which has enabled him to manipulate elections and suppress political opposition with impunity. Biya's legacy is one of authoritarian rule, economic stagnation, and unwavering loyalty to France at the expense of Cameroonian sovereignty. He is a clear example of how Western-backed dictators continue to serve foreign interests while their own people suffer under political oppression and economic hardship. Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, from 1965 to 1997, becoming one of the most infamous Western-backed dictators in African history. Installed and maintained by the CIA, Belgium, and France, Mobutu was a key figure in ensuring Western economic and geopolitical control over one of Africa's richest countries in natural resources. His rise to power was directly linked to the Western-backed overthrow and assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961, Congo's first prime minister who had sought to nationalize the country's vast mineral wealth and free it from Western dominance. After Lumumba's murder, carried out with the involvement of the CIA and Belgian intelligence, Mobutu was groomed by the United States as a reliable anti-communist ally during the Cold War. With full US and Belgian support, he staged a coup in 1965, taking absolute power and turning Zaire into a corrupt, authoritarian regime that primarily served foreign interests. Throughout his rule, Mobutu allowed American, Belgian, and French corporations to control Zaire's vast resources, including copper, cobalt, uranium, and diamonds. In exchange for Western military and financial support, Zaire's mineral wealth fueled Western industries, especially the US nuclear weapons program, which relied on Congolese uranium. In return, the West provided billions in aid and military assistance to prop up Mobutu's dictatorship, ignoring his regime's brutal repression, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement. Mobutu amassed an estimated $5 billion in personal wealth, stashing money in Swiss bank accounts while his country fell into extreme poverty. He built extravagant palaces and lived lavishly while basic infrastructure crumbled and public services collapsed. His rule was also characterized by brutal political repression. Opponents were arrested, tortured, or killed, and he maintained power through fraudulent elections and state-sponsored violence. The CIA and French intelligence ensured that Mobutu remained in control as long as he protected Western corporate interests and suppressed Soviet influence in Central Africa. However, after the Cold War ended, the West no longer needed him, and in 1997, Laurent Désiré Kabila, backed by Rwanda and Uganda, overthrew Mobutu. He fled into exile in Morocco, where he died in disgrace. Mobutu's legacy is that of a leader who looted his country while serving as a puppet for Western powers, sacrificing Congo's wealth and development to enrich himself and his foreign backers. His reign left Zaire in economic ruin, setting the stage for the devastating conflicts that followed his downfall. He remains one of the most notorious African leaders who prioritized Western interests over national sovereignty. Alassane Ouattara has been president of Côte d'Ivoire since 2011, and his leadership has been defined by his unwavering loyalty to France, the International Monetary Fund (IMF), and Western corporations. Before becoming president, Ouattara had deep ties to Western financial institutions, serving as an economist for the IMF and later as deputy managing director of the organization. His background made him the perfect candidate for Western interests in Africa, as he was seen as a leader who would prioritize foreign investment and neoliberal economic policies that benefited multinational corporations. Ouattara's rise to power was controversial and heavily backed by France and the United Nations. In the 2010 presidential election, he faced incumbent Laurent Gbagbo, a nationalist leader who resisted French economic dominance and sought to reduce Western influence in Côte d'Ivoire. After a disputed election, France and the UN launched a military intervention to forcibly remove Gbagbo and install Ouattara as president in 2011. This marked the beginning of Ouattara's rule as one of the most pro-Western leaders in Africa, implementing policies that prioritized foreign investors while increasing Côte d'Ivoire's dependency on France and Western financial institutions. Under Ouattara, Côte d'Ivoire has remained tightly controlled by France, especially through the CFA franc, a currency controlled by the French treasury that limits economic independence. His administration has signed major deals with French companies in key sectors such as agriculture, banking, and infrastructure, allowing them to dominate the Ivorian economy. Cocoa, the country's most valuable export, continues to be largely controlled by French multinational corporations, which profit while many Ivorian farmers struggle in poverty. Additionally, Ouattara's policies have increased Côte d'Ivoire's debt to the IMF and World Bank, as he has taken large loans that come with harsh austerity measures, privatization of national industries, and reduced public services. Politically, Ouattara has clung to power using authoritarian tactics. In 2020, he violated the Ivorian constitution by running for an unconstitutional third term, sparking mass protests and accusations that he was turning Côte d'Ivoire into a dictatorship under Western approval. His government has suppressed opposition, arrested political rivals, and used security forces to crush protests, while France and its allies continue to support him because of his pro-Western stance. Ouattara's legacy is that of a leader who serves Western economic interests over national sovereignty, ensuring that Côte d'Ivoire remains a neo-colonial state where French businesses profit while ordinary Ivorians face economic struggles. His rule has deepened dependency on foreign loans and corporate exploitation, making him one of the most loyal Western-backed leaders in Africa today. Idriss Deby. Idriss Deby ruled Chad from 1990 until his death in 2021, serving as one of France's most loyal military strongmen in Africa, while ensuring that Western interests, especially in oil and counter-terrorism, were protected at all costs. His rule was defined by authoritarian control, military dominance, and unwavering subservience to France, which backed him for over 3 decades despite his regime's human rights abuses and corruption. Deby first came to power in a French-backed coup in 1990, overthrowing Hissène Habré, another pro-French dictator, after France decided to shift its support to a more controllable ally. Throughout his presidency, Deby allowed French oil companies, particularly Total Energies, to dominate Chad's petroleum industry, ensuring that oil profits flowed to foreign corporations and the Chadian elite, while much of the population remained in poverty. Despite Chad's oil wealth, very little of it was invested in social services, infrastructure, or economic development, with Deby prioritizing military expansion and personal enrichment over national progress. His biggest role, however, was as France's military enforcer in the Sahel region. Chad became a key base for French and U.S. counterterrorism operations, allowing foreign military forces to operate freely under the pretext of fighting Islamic insurgents in the region. Deby deployed Chadian troops to conflicts in Mali, the Central African Republic, and Nigeria, often acting as a proxy force for Western interests. In return, France provided financial and military assistance, ensuring that Deby remained in power despite growing internal opposition. Whenever his rule was threatened, France intervened directly to protect him, most notably in 2008 and 2019, when French airstrikes were used to stop rebel forces from advancing on the capital, N'Djamena. Deby ruled Chad as a military dictatorship, suppressing opposition, restricting press freedoms, and violently crushing protests. Despite calls for democratic reforms, he manipulated elections and changed the constitution to extend his rule indefinitely, all with French diplomatic backing. His reign finally ended in April 2021, when he was killed under mysterious circumstances while leading his troops against rebel forces in battle. Almost immediately, France endorsed his son, Mahamat Deby, as Chad's new leader, ensuring the continuation of Deby's pro-French, military-controlled government. Idriss Deby's legacy is that of a dictator who prioritized French and Western military interests over Chad's sovereignty and development. His regime turned Chad into a militarized state, serving as a Western outpost in Africa, ensuring the survival of Françafrique while keeping his people in poverty and political repression. His death did not mark an end to Chad's neo-colonial subservience to France, as his son now continues his dynastic rule with full Western support. I know you were expecting more video like this, so hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.